Hello and welcome to the Mother Festival at Wheeler Centre. I am Karen Pickering. I will be chairing this panel, and I wanted to start by acknowledging that we are all gathered on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I encourage you to do the same before we start. And I also wanted to acknowledge that this conversation is taking place after thousands of years of other conversations about motherhood that have happened in this country, and I wanted to just make a special mention of the Black matriarchy before we start. The housekeeping is a long list, but I'm going to do it now before we get into the flow of things. Some of you will have your kids here, and they're so welcome. And you can see up the back on the side, there's a special section for them to hang out and play. We do still need you to keep an eye on them. It's not like the IKEA one where you just drop them off. There are more comfy seats at the back for anyone who needs to breastfeed or anyone who just feels uncomfortable in these seats. I know that some of us might have ongoing birth injuries, and damage that means sitting in regular seats is not the easiest. I would be sitting in the back if I was in the audience. There is also a separate private room for anyone who needs to breastfeed or pump that has amenities like a kettle and PowerPoints and privacy. And then now we're kind of getting into the broad content note for the whole session, which is that we're probably going to be touching on or diving right into topics that are really sensitive and really vulnerable. And so I just wanted to flag that with everyone. You probably understand that as you're at a panel, part of a festival about motherhood. But we are inviting you all to walk outside and take a breather if you need to. There are a lot of support services listed on the Wheeler Centre website, and you can also just ask any staff member if you need any help. If you could make sure that your phones are on silent, because this session is being live streamed. So hello to everyone joining us from places other than the Wheeler Centre, and it's being recorded. So you're very welcome to keep your phones on if you want to be looking at socials or taking notes, but just on silent would be great.
Good job.
Thanks. And we're not going to have a Q&A today because it's a relatively short session. I just think we've got such a wealth of expertise and opinion and commentary to share in today's. But we do understand that these topics will probably make you want to talk more, so we would encourage you to keep having these conversations after the session. You can take to the comment section of the Wheeler's socials, which are moderated as well. And the music that you heard on the way in and that you'll hear again on the way out is from the album Matrescence by Claire Tonti, and that is available to buy in the bookstore, along with works by the panellists, including, as of today, for this session only, Isabelle Oderberg's new book. Wow. Yes.
I almost had a heart attack. I thought my publicist was going to kill me, and then I had to call her and be like, do you realise they've got the book? They've got the book. They've got it. It's here.
It's
anyway, it's
released.
fine. I have permission. It's all good.
and she's fine about it. As
Yeah,
you can see.
she's a very
really wants
kick-ass
you to read
lady.
her
I was
book.
terrified, so feel free to pick up a copy.
Gina's book is also going to be available in the bookstore as well. So now I'm just going to have a sip of water. Rehydrate.
I don't have a book for sale. Yeah, just so we can.
Try and sell mine. Just sell mine. That's fine.
Great
Yeah,
books,
fine.
yep.
You can buy 2 copies of theirs. Yeah. So now I'm going to introduce the panellists to you. You probably already know a little bit about them, and you may also you already got strong ideas about what we should talk about today. Hopefully, we will touch on some of the issues that you all have in mind, but just bear in mind that it is really difficult to cover everything to do with deciding whether or not to have a child in such a short period of time with only a handful of us. So here are our guests today. We have Senator Jana Stewart, who's a proud Muddy Muddy and Wamba Wamba woman from northwest Victoria, and mother to Jude and Ari, our smallest and most smooshable guest. Jana is the youngest First Nations woman to be elected to federal parliament and is the first Aboriginal Labor senator for Victoria. Yes. Jana comes from a long line of strong Aboriginal women stretching back over 60,000 years. She is the first in her family to attend university, receiving 2 degrees to become a family therapist. And she also worked at VACA, the Victorian Aboriginal Childcare Agency, in child protection and keeping families together. So she's extremely qualified to talk about this question today. Please welcome Senator Jana Stewart. And next, I've got them in the wrong order. Here we go. Gina Rushton is the author of The Most Important Job in the World. How's that title? So good. And the news editor of Crikey. Her work has been published in The Monthly, Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, Australia Associated Press, Saturday paper The Australian, Sydney Morning Herald and The Guardian. Please welcome Gina Rushton. And Isabelle, where are you? It's a secret
I'm
underneath. Isabelle Oderberg is a journalist, writer and editor. She has worked for the Herald Sun, News Corp, Reuters, Dow Jones and Business Spectator, and is currently the acting editor of Pro Bono News. Her first book, Hard to Bear, Investigating the Science and Silence of Miscarriage, will be released to the rest of the public in April 2023, but you can buy an advance copy today. Please welcome Izzy Oderberg. And as I mentioned before, I'm Karen Pickering. I am a writer and organiser, and I am working on a book on motherhood shock. And so that should give you a sense of what it was like for me to become a parent.
And about bloody time, which was fantastic.
That's right. And the last book that I co-wrote with Jane Bennett was about bloody time. The menstrual revolution we have to have. And I'm also a single mum and a sole carer of a disabled child. So my experiences aren't always included or mentioned in public discussions of motherhood, so I'm really glad to get a chance to talk about some of those issues today. So that's us. And please join me in a round of applause for the panellists who've joined us. And you are going to be a really important part of this conversation as well as we finish the session, and hopefully you'll be able to you can come up and talk to any of the panellists. You can buy a book and have it signed. Hopefully you'll be talking about this stuff with everyone you meet from not from now on. I mean, you'll have other conversations, but so let me just introduce the discussion. I I was thinking about how the question of whether or not to have children is a really complex one and can be a really thorny and vexed one. And can also be a really joyful and simple and straightforward one. So many women have been considering this question since childhood. And certainly once they begin managing their fertility, which often starts in your teens, you start managing your own fertility, which just from this vantage point seems ill-advised, but that's what happens. And the possibility that you can become pregnant at that time is usually pretty scary. Later in life, it's sometimes more scary to think that you might not be able to become pregnant. So I think a lot of women will spend, say, 10, 15 years making sure they don't get pregnant, and then maybe the same amount of time thinking a lot about whether they want to, how they're going to, how they might have to rearrange and organise their lives to fit it in, whether they need to convince other people to do that with them. And it's in some cases, I think also on a lot of women to work out how to support themselves through pregnancy and birth and beyond, because not everyone has partners or supportive networks around them to help with that decision or the realities of what comes afterwards. And of course, for all of our talk of choice, it can sometimes be an illusion that we're in control of our fertility, and sometimes the decisions are made for us by others, by the state, by failing infrastructure, and sometimes even by our own bodies and the passage of time. It's a lot for us to carry, and I think that the more openly and expansively we talk about it, the better for everyone, no matter where they are in that decision-making process. So just a note that what we're going to talk about today could be really difficult or confronting for you in the audience, but it would be great to keep in mind that it might be the same for the panellists as well, and that they are really generously sharing their experiences and possibly even making disclosures that are really vulnerable. And so if we could all just move gently around that in terms of if you're grabbing snippets to post online, just being really conscious that what we're talking about is really sensitive stuff. So, should we get into it?
Yeah, let's do it.
The mother of all questions is a big subject. So I wanted to open by asking all of the panellists if you can remember the first time that you considered the question of whether or not you wanted to become a mother.
You're looking at me because I'm going first, am I?
Well,
okay, all right, that's fine. So it was just in my mind, just absolutely accepted that I didn't want kids. From a really, really young age, I had sort of, my job was everything. I went to London, I worked in Reuters, I worked at Dow Jones, I worked at a whole, that was where my absolute focus was. And then when I came back to Australia, I was earning a good income, I was an executive editor out of Sydney, I was travelling a lot, and, I was selfish and I was having just a really good time. So it just wasn't on my radar at all. And what happened was that I slowly started to feel empty and feel like there was something I was missing. And it took me a long time, but I came to the conclusion that it was sort of like family. It was kids, and I just felt this desire to start a family. But I'm really impatient, and so I decided to have IUI on my own. That was my first decision. And
just tell people what that is.
Sorry, so it's intrauterine insemination. So it's not IVF. It's like not as invasive. Basically, it's like turkey baster, medical turkey baster. That's what we're talking about here. So I spoke to my mum in H&M because that's where these important discussions really do need to happen. And she said, that's a great idea. You should totally do it. And Dad just does whatever we think is the best. He goes along with it because we're those sorts of women. And I guess it wasn't, I didn't need anyone's approval, but it's good to know that everyone's on board with these sorts of things. And I did one cycle with a donor, and it didn't work. And 2 weeks later, I met the man who's now my husband, and, you know, timing, whatever, and could have saved a bit of cash if I'd met him 2 weeks earlier, but anyway, whatever. And so, we got, you know, we're much older when we met and got together quickly, and he is an Aboriginal man. Family is just incredibly important to him. He already had one child when we met, and we knew very quickly we would be having kids. So, and then obviously my journey, which I'm not going to go into it because everyone else needs to talk to, but I had a very, very difficult journey. I have 2 living children. I had 7 pregnancy losses of various forms. And that's what my book is about. But don't worry, it's not depressing like it sounds. It's there, you know. But it became, through that experience, once my journey in birthing was over, I made the decision that I wanted to go back and investigate a whole lot of stuff that I had acknowledged and seen through that journey. But the decision to become a parent was an absolute surprise to me because I had never intended to do it. So that's me. Gina, please say something. Say something, Gina, say something.
Well, I hadn't seriously considered it. I think we sort of socialised to think that the answer comes before the question. You just know you want to be a mum. You know that you want it. And I'd never heard that yes, so I just very, very, very much assumed it was a no. Always thought I really didn't want kids. Spent most of my career reporting on, you know, the fight for people to be able to not have kids or have reproductive autonomy. And then I had an emergency surgery. Basically, I ended up in an ambulance in a hospital and bleeding internally, and they said one of your ovaries is dead, which even reporting on reproductive healthcare, I didn't know that was a thing. They said we're going to have to go in, cut it out. Obviously, halving the number of sites in your body where you can produce an egg is not great for fertility. And I just burst into tears and lost the plot in emergency in a way that I was extremely surprised by and very embarrassed by. And it wasn't that I just was like, oh, I definitely want to become a mum. It was like, oh, I actually need to justify or have a really, really strong list of reasons why I don't want to, if that's my answer. And then my ovary lived, but once they drained all the blood out, it was a really big burst ovarian cyst, which I'm sure people in this room have gone through. They found endometriosis, which is not a surprise. It's like a classic, I just always thought periods were that painful and whatnot, which of course impacts fertility. So now that question's become really real for me because there might be a shorter time limit than for other people. Yeah.
And you wrote a whole book about it. So
I wrote a whole book about it. Yeah. About the decision. I spent 9 months trying to figure out if I did or didn't want kids.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book, and you really take into account a lot of really big picture issues in our culture and in our society. It's not sort of just about whether you will have kids or not. It's about the question itself and how we make that choice.
Yeah, and it's trying to validate that for some people it isn't just a really straightforward question, and kind of validate the ambivalence or ambiguity in that, because for many people now I think it really is a choice that comes with a big period of decision making, and I think that's there's not always space for that. I think that's sort of seen as well, if you want to be a mum, and I don't think that it's often as clear cut as that.
Yeah, thank you.
Jana, do you want kids?
No, I don't like them. Such an inconvenience. I don't ever remember it being a choice in that. I think there was just this big assumption, like in my family and in my community, that you just have kids. It's just something that you do. So even as a teenager, I did, there were lots of conversations about, when you grow up and have kids, when you have your own family. It was never a if you do, if you want to. So I feel like there's just an assumed that you're going to. And I suppose the reason I didn't really find it to, I don't know quite what the right word is. is that for me, it didn't feel like if I'm having a baby, I'm having it on my own. If I'm having a baby, I'm having it with my family. Because and I know that for lots of non-Aboriginal people, that's not the same experience. So I know that when I'm having a baby, I'm having it with incredible family support around me. It's not something I have to do on my own. And there are lots of women who make the decision knowing they don't have that same support. So yeah, I remember one of the things my mum would say to me is just don't have a baby too young, because she was 19 when she had me. She goes, travel the world, buy a house, do all those things before you settle down and decide to have babies. And then I think 2 years into a relationship with my husband, she's like, where's my grandbabies? Where's my grandbabies?
Make up your mind, Mum.
Yeah, that's right. I'm like, Mum, 21 for starters. But I had my first baby at 28, and that's old in my community. So lots of my cousins around me had finished having their families by then, and they were at least 5 and 6 years younger than me. So I was old in my family to be having babies. But there wasn't, other than my mum every now and again joking about wanting to make sure she's got more grandbabies than my auntie did, there wasn't necessarily a whole lot of pressure, and so it felt like it was up to me. But I could make that decision based on the fact that I knew that I would have lots of people around me, that it wasn't just me that had the responsibility for raising these kids. It was me and my brothers and sisters and my aunties and uncles that makes it you feel like you're being held in a way that I think lots of other non-Aboriginal families have. I think that's really unique for us. So this idea of the nuclear family and you have to do it all on your own and you don't ask for help is just so jarring to my experience.
Yeah.
I take my hat off to people who do it on their own, because I just don't know how people could.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, I was 38 when I had my child, and I was the youngest mum in my mum's group.
Wow.
Yeah, I was going to say, when you said 28, I have a friend who had a kid at 28, and we called her a teen mum.
Yeah.
Well, there's this interesting thing, right? So
when I was 28, I didn't want to have, I didn't want to have kids. At 28, I thought that, it seemed like not something that was in my future. And then I turned 30, and it was like being hit in the head with a hammer, or hit in the womb with a hammer. And it was just a kind of instantaneous, overnight, physical, bodily longing that just never went away until I gave birth. And
then it went away real quick.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's just me.
But I do think that the age at which you choose to have kids is really interesting, because, from what I understand at least, Aboriginal women and families aren't having babies young. We've always had babies that age, but actually the rest of the population are having babies older.
Yeah.
But it's interesting the impact that draws to you in the system and in the child protection system, because you get labelled as a young mum and all of a sudden you need more support. Yeah. So it's interesting how the rest of the system responds to us remaining the same and having our babies young, but it's acceptable to have your babies later, and nobody's looking at that. As a risk factor for your kids.
And when I interviewed a whole lot of Aboriginal mums, and within my family, but also external to our family, one of the things they said is when you come from a place of genocide, our parents are we need to bring the songlines back, we need to have children. It's become even more important among those people that I was talking to do it young, if you want to have a lot of children, if you want to kind of almost, reinvigorate the populations and have people to hand those stories down to.
So I've got, I think my mum will have 4 grandbabies in 12 months, so we're doing our bit.
That's sometimes one of those complex arguments or complex discussions that gets reduced to something really simplistic when you read articles about, whether it's ethical to have children, given climate catastrophe. And then First Nations people are saying, well, it's a very different situation for us, and that we're, thinking about survival and reversing the effects of genocide. It's very different when white middle class people are deciding whether or not they can have a baby in an ethical way. You know, I
That's
think
okay because black kids are going to save the world. So we're good.
Let's hope
They're going to
so.
turn
But
it all around.
I find the conversation around reproduction and fertility really interesting because for Aboriginal women that was controlled for us. So I think it's always a difficult conversation to have in our communities.
Yeah. And you said just before, that within Aboriginal communities, or rather the way that they're surveilled or, treated by the mainstream, the question of how young you are when you have a baby can be used against you. And then, like you said, in mainstream or, non-Aboriginal women, it's accepted as much more, it's more socially acceptable to have babies older. But it does actually then bring real risks in the way that you're treated within the medical system, in the way that you are going to be deemed a high advanced maternal age, geriatric pregnancy.
Geriatric.
You're going to have your BMI constantly more aggressively policed. And yeah, so I think, and for many women, coming to the question too late means that their fertility, works against them. Well, too late, but at the time that that the rest of society is deeming reasonable, your late 30s, it's increasingly becoming a very common age to have your first child.
Yeah, I definitely went through a period of extreme rage when I started investigating, I was having miscarriage after miscarriage, and when I started investigating the science and realising that, every year that went by, my risk profile was leaping up the chart. And, the thing about the sort of the school of feminism, if I can call it that, is that you're always told how to control your fertility, and it's given a kind of this false narrative that you can choose when not to have a child. That's the correct bit, but you can choose when to have a child, and that's the false bit. You can decide you want to have a child, but your body or external factors may have a different idea. And that is not, for me, and this is personal, but for me it is absolutely not adequately explained to people. No one is saying, get back in the kitchen, have a baby at, barefoot in the kitchen, at 21. I'm not saying that, but I think everyone with a uterus has the right to know what the risk is if they leave it too long, because it's a fact, it's a medical scientific fact that there are a lot of complications that happen as you get older. And I was particularly had to work through a lot of rage at the sort of the feminist structure around not ever being educated in that way. I was told where to get contraception. I was told my mum and I had very open dialogues about, if you are ever pregnant, you don't want to have a baby, you come to me and we get you an abortion. It was a very open, no one ever said to me, and I'm not blaming you, Mum, don't worry, but no one ever said to me, when you hit 35, your risk profile is completely different and you are going to face a whole lot of different hurdles. I was also really, really badly gestational diabetic, through both of my pregnancies because I was much older, so.
Yeah, we're gonna talk a lot about risk and how it's conceived of in the panel later today, Labour of Love. So hopefully you'll be able to join us there as well. Talking more specifically about the ageing maternal population, it obviously genuinely has a lot of impacts on on the decision making, but also on what people's experience of new motherhood will be like, what the pregnancy and birth will be like, what impact it will have on your career, and obviously your relationships and friendships and your relationship to your whole community changes. And so I wanted to talk about how, for a lot of women, in my experience and in my research, they feel as though the decision is not completely up to them if they're partnered with someone who is unsure. And I think for a lot of women, they maybe do wait out a lot of those years in which they maybe are more biologically robust, more likely to conceive, waiting for their male partners to be ready. And I think that that's a kind of really common cultural narrative that we see played out over and over, where a lot of women will have kids later than they wanted to because they were waiting for someone else to be ready, or they miss out altogether because that window closes while they're trying to convince someone else. Have any of you experienced, you talked about with your partner, you both were immediately on the same page, and
Yeah, but I mean, once I made the decision that I did want to become a parent, I certainly wasn't waiting around for anyone else. That's just not how I've ever lived my life, and I couldn't see myself doing that for anything, let alone for a family. So I just went ahead and I did it. I went and I, walked into Melbourne IVF and got a donor list, and, off we went. I think it was 3 months from the time I walked in to, you have to go through a lot of counselling and that kind of stuff. And, and then I was having, the turkey baster situation. So, and I remember my mum holding my hand, and when I was having the procedure, the baster was happening, and I'm in the stirrups, the feet are up, and mum's holding my hand, and I look at mum and she's got like a tear. I went, no, none of that shit. I'm not interested. No, there doesn't need to be love in this room and emotion in this room for me to get pregnant. And the doctor said, and the doctor looked up from between the stirrups and said, actually, that's true of any conception. So that was one of the funnier moments in the journey. But yeah, so I think, and certainly I did a lot of research before and after that when I did some commentary around it, and there's no question that there is definitely a moving trend towards people with uteruses making the decision that they're going to be solo parents by choice. Solo parents by choice is what it's called in America. Here, I think I can't remember. Anyway, solo parent by choice, basically. And I think that's something we're going to keep seeing more and more of.
There's definitely, and
I have family members who've done it as well.
Yeah, there's a session in this festival discussing this question as well, with Alexandra Collier's new book has come out, and Inconceivable.
Endorsed.
It's good. I endorsed it.
Endorsed by Gina.
But I just wanted to kind of zoom out a bit, and I mean, it's great for you to keep giving examples from your personal life, but about what are some of the factors that go into making this decision? So, Jana, you talked about how one factor was knowing that you did have a community, knowing that there was already a network of people who were waiting for this kid to get here, or these kids to get here, so that they could be a part of the care of that child. That's obviously a huge advantage.
So for me, I'll pull this closer. For me, there were a couple of other things for me as well. I grew up in a home where there was family violence. So for me, and like my mum talked about staying because she wanted her kids to grow up with a father figure, because us three older kids, like our dads weren't around, but she wanted them to have a dad in their life. And so I suppose I was kind of really resentful of the fact that, like you say, in a violent relationship, because you want a man around. And for me, it was much more, as an adult, I've always thought it's much more important. And with the things that I've learned through the work that I've done, the things that I've studied, understood how much more important it is to role model healthy relationships. So for me, it was then about making sure that I'm in a relationship that demonstrates what good relationships look like. Not perfect, but good, because your kids are going to grow up and much more like they model their relationships based on your relationship. So for me, it was important to make sure that we had a foundation that I was happy to raise kids in. We also didn't have much growing up, so I wanted to. One of the things that sounds so funny to say it, but like financially stable enough that if my kid needed a new pair of shoes, I could afford to just go and buy it, even if it was an off pay week. Right? So just some really basic things about being able to afford to have kids, and it's like we had to lay by things, all that kind of stuff, which is completely fine. But I knew the type of thing, the type of life I wanted to be able to provide for my kids. So when we were able to, do that, I'm like, okay, now we can have kids. We can buy a pair of shoes, we don't have to save for it. were a couple of other things for me that I thought about having kids too.
Yeah. What about you, Gina? Obviously, it's all through your book, but...
Well, it's interesting hearing you talking about people kind of delaying that decision. I think it feeds into what everyone has talked about, which is that I think that increasingly having kids, and I think it's because we failed to socialise the cost of reproduction and the cost of childbearing and child rearing, is that it's increasingly seen as a luxury choice and a kind of something that you need to get yourself to a point where you are able to do it. And I think that means financially, like in basically every conversation I had for the book and interview I had, that came up, like, you know, is it ethical to have a kid when, you know, you haven't reached X amount of financial stability? Of course it's not unethical. Like everyone, if you want a kid, you should be able to do it whether you're living in a housing commission or a mansion. Like that mentality, and the fact that it had seeped into every conversation was bizarre, I think. And I think people are I think that there's sort of a millennial hyper-awareness of how harm moves through generations, whether that is trauma, whether it is like we're extremely aware of the consequences of actions of people taken before us when it comes to the climate, you know, political legacies, all of that kind of thing. And I think that there was also this real hyper... I mean, I guess at its worst, maybe we're just like over-therapized or something, or we've, you know, read too much. I don't know. But this idea that we're so acutely aware of how our parents have fucked us up that we are intent on like becoming this kind of unreachable person who is okay enough or self-aware enough or you know, yeah, sort of has reached a point where they can have kids and not pass on all these different things. I mean, of course, the risk there is that you overcorrect and you become like, I don't know, neurotic. You know, your parents neglected you.
I don't know what you're talking about.
I don't know what you're talking about. But anyway, I think, you know, that there's an economic thing, and I think there's also just, and it's not a terrible thing. Like, people are thinking really consciously about what they would be like as parents. But I do think that it definitely seeped into each conversation that people felt like they had to arrive at this, you know, they had to be in this perfect relationship, they had to be financially stable, they had to have housing, which is increasingly, you know, most of my friends are renters. And I think it's kind of a big burden to place on yourself in that decision-making process.
And it also seems like the flip side of it is that lots of people still seem to have babies with people that they're fundamentally incompatible with.
Yeah.
Hi, it's me. I'm the problem. It's me. And there's a kind of, again, so the book that I'm working on is about motherhood shock, and so I'm making the argument that until you go through it, it's really impossible to know. And in fact, we're kind of, you know, we're setting up women to fail because we're not preparing them well enough for all of the different ways in which new motherhood will impact your life, that it will have an impact on your body and your health, on your relationships, your friendships, your career, your cognitive abilities, your, you know, your ability to volunteer and participate in the community, like so many things that we don't think about because we, I guess, romanticize, or we're encouraged to romanticize and gloss over the difficulties and just think about these delicious babies that are going to come. And about this like fulfillment of ourselves as real women, and there's a lot of different narratives that feed into it. But I think the point that I was trying to make is that you don't know. You can have all of these plans, but you don't know if you're going to end up being a single mum, even if it's not by choice. You don't know if your kid's going to be disabled and really high needs. You don't know what injuries you are going to sustain. You don't know what kind of birth you're going to have. You don't know what kind of baby you're going to have. And so the risk is that, me just saying all of that just then is very sort of unpopular and unwelcome in some forums, because it's very kind of doom and gloom, and it almost sounds like maybe I'm saying you shouldn't have a baby, or that everything like in the Eleanor Jackson, who's also in the festival, wrote a beautiful book of poetry called Gravidity and Parody. And one of the lines she says is that, particularly talking about miscarriage, I think, she says, everything can go right, but everything can go wrong. And that's life. And so when you're bringing a new life into the world, that is really kind of supercharged.
There's a line in that book where she says, it's my favourite line in the book, where she's talking about, a lot of the book is centred around her experience of miscarriage, and she says, a Rorschach test in your underwear. You know?
It's a stunning book.
It's a stunning book.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, that you know that there's that sort of like that thing that women tell each other, that you never talk about how horrible birth can be, because if you do, no one will have babies. You know that thing that we all say, like you don't go to someone who's pregnant and say, I had the worst birth and it was like this happened and that happened, I have a prolapsed rectum and like, you know, all this stuff. You just don't talk about it, right? Because otherwise we won't procreate, we'll just die as a species. And so I think that there's so much that just doesn't, I had a cesarean. There's so much that doesn't get said. And what that does is it actually leaves us totally unprepared for when things go wrong or not according to plan, right? And the thing that I hear so much from people is, that wasn't my story, that was not what's supposed to happen to me, right? And you know, I had all these losses, and then I finally got pregnant. I got to 12 weeks, and my NAPT came back as high risk for Downs, and that, you know, it was my fifth pregnancy in a row after my living son, and I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, how unfair is this? Now I have to make some really horrible decisions, right? And it's never going to, in your mind, I think it's never going to be you. Like, you've heard stories about what happens when does everyone know what an NIPT test is? NIPT test is a blood test that tests what they call cell-free DNA. So it's a way of checking for chromosomal abnormalities, a variety of them, the most probably common of which is T21, which is Down syndrome. And, you know, in the end, my body made the decision for me in that the pregnancy was actually not viable. But it's that thing of like, that's not my story. My story is that pregnant baby, not just pregnant baby, pregnant healthy baby, pregnant baby sleeps, baby eats, baby doesn't have a lactose intolerance, baby is perfect, I am perfect, everyone's happy, my marriage is great, like there's no stress on my marriage from having a newborn in the house, right? And then there's no stress from having to pay for daycare 5 days a week so that I can go back to work. That's not my story. My story is perfect, right? And so every little thing that doesn't go according to plan is like being hit in the face repeatedly with a cold wet kipper, because you're like, that's not what happens to me. So
yeah, I just wanted to add to that, you know, if we kind of also zoom out a bit, and this will sort of lead us into the next question, the last question that we have time for, is about the systems that are in place. Is that it's not actually that you'll have a disabled child that is a terrible thing. It's that there will be a society that has no intention of supporting you and that child. If you wanted to send your kids to childcare, we should have a universal free childcare system, obviously, in every school, so that you know, people are supported in this. So if for everything that can go wrong, that's, you know, these high-risk births that end up in birth trauma, like, it doesn't have to be this way.
Every cost that you incur to go to work, right? You're a senator. Every cost that you incur to go to work is tax deductible. But the cost of having someone care for your child so that you can work is not tax deductible. How is that possible? Like, how does it? I literally cannot work unless someone is caring for my child. But yet I'm penalised by not having that as a deduction so that I can do my job. Yeah, it just makes no sense.
One of the many absurdities enshrined in law that make it very difficult for women and people who can get pregnant to transition into new motherhood and new parenthood, which brings us to talking about reproductive justice as you know, the giant umbrella term that encompasses so many of these questions. When we're talking about the fact that people can't get access to childcare, can't find safe accommodation for themselves, can't access terminations depending on where they are in the country, can't care for their children if they're incarcerated at rates that, are much higher than the rest of the community. All of these different issues that seem unconnected all fall under the same banner of reproductive justice. So I thought I'd ask Gina, because it's your field of expertise and you talk about it so incredibly helpfully throughout your book, that we need to start joining the dots on all of these questions, because when we silo off particular concerns and say, well, the most urgent thing is that we have, more midwives, or the most urgent thing is that we have, they're actually all connected. And so can you just talk us through that concept for everyone?
Yeah, so we often think about reproductive rights as, and I did for a very long time, and reported on it for a very long time with this kind of framework, as the right to prevent and terminate a pregnancy. So basically the right not to be a parent. And reproductive justice is a much more expansive and exciting way to think about reproductive rights, because it incorporates the right to become a parent. And we know all of these things are connected. Like, you look at what's happening with Roe v. Wade, and we know that the right, access to D&Cs, like that is for people who want terminations, that is for people who have miscarriages. Like, all of the things, doctors already know how linked many of these fights are. But it's really important to think about reproductive justice in this really expansive way. One, because the history of the reproductive rights movement is so fraught, and so, if you look at the, I'm not going to give a history lesson, but if you look at the roots of every family planning organisation here and abroad, it is racist, it is filled with eugenics, it is really, really dark, and as is the history for a lot of, mainstream white feminism. But reproductive justice goes beyond that. And when you start thinking about the right not just to prevent or terminate a pregnancy, but to have a child and to parent that child in a safe environment with clean drinking water, with free from state interference or surveillance, all of these battles that we're having independently start to come together in this, like, genuinely, I think, exciting and expansive way. And it's... it was really just so eye-opening for me. Like, as a reporter, I was like, I'm reporting on reproductive rights. I also report on things that affect women. And it was like childcare, like all of these other things. And I had never, ever thought of those two as linked until I, read more.
Yeah. And also that the reproductive justice is a framework that invites so many more people.
Yeah.
It's frustrating to me that all human beings don't care about women's rights, but they don't. And so if we think about reproductive justice, also it cuts across so many other intersections and allows us to really imagine. It is exciting. We're nerding out. But it allows us to imagine really incredibly powerful solutions across all different facets of society, because reproductive justice will include every single person. It's not just mums. It's not just, well, you have a child that you birthed, so therefore you have more right to speak about, as a mum, the as a mum thing. And we really need to have people who care about justice and social justice, caring about reproductive justice as as an imperative of whether or not we're going to survive.
So what's interesting is, so the reproductive justice, the terminology, it was coined by Loretta Ross in America, and it's a combination of reproductive rights and social justice. So it's just to give a bit of insight. And the way that it was launched was during the Reagan administration, around revamping of the American medical system. It was launched by 50 black African-American civil rights campaigners, and it's evolved to be something called Sister Song now, which is, I think, 16 organisations. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. But what's interesting and what's applicable to the Australian context, in my humble opinion, is that the reproductive justice movement in America, absolutely the core of it is that people from marginalised groups have to be at the centre, controlling it, moving it, deciding what is going to be acted upon, right? And white women take a back seat, which is exactly how it should be, because we've tried the trickle down, it doesn't work. The trickle down, right? Trickle up is more likely to work. So the whole point of American reproductive justice, as it was coined, as it was evolved, is that people who are people of colour, people who are gender diverse, people who are poor, people who are from lower classes, people who are Indigenous, people who, have a disability, all of these things are centred and make the core decisions around the movement and how it works. And what's interesting, and this is what I think, if I can build on what you said, around issues that might not seem like they're directly pertaining to motherhood. An example from Australia is that in Aboriginal communities, for instance, there are higher rates of chlamydia. Chlamydia leads to scarring of the fallopian tissues. It results in higher rates of ectopic pregnancies, and it makes conception much more difficult. This is an example where basic healthcare and just general, education being given to those communities results in them not being able to parent the way that they choose. And that's why what Gina said is so important, because it's more holistic than just giving people access to IVF when they're poor and can't afford it the way that I could, and it's absolutely core to the movement.
But it's so, just to add to that, it's so true about women of colour and First Nations communities being at the front of it, because for a long time, when we talked about feminism, I didn't see feminism as actually a place that was for black women, right? Mm-hmm. Because whenever you see people get up and talk about the gender pay gap or talk about the experiences of women, that's not my women. Mm-hmm. And I know it's not, because when I look at the statistics for First Nations women or women of colour, refugee women, the statistics are so much bigger. Mm. And until we see ourselves represented in the way that we talk about the challenges we face, it's harder to actually educate, you don't have the natural curiosity to go and find out more about it, to even educate yourself, because you don't see yourselves in the things, in the words that our leaders say.
You weren't even, the Aboriginal women were locked out of the feminist movement in this country quite deliberately for a very long time, and it's time to recentre the movement completely. To put the sovereign owners of the country at the centre of it. Like, there's just no question.
One of my biggest bugbears is when we talk about diversity being, having 50% women. Like, no, that's just gender balance.
This is
That's just gender balance. Yeah. That's not diversity.
No. Yeah.
Don't talk to me about diversity and then just have white women stand up there. That's not what diversity looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's what happens.
And thinking about, representing people who are disabled and people who are,
absolutely
unhoused and people, other forms
and the Kimberly Crenshaw kind of like definition of intersectionality isn't just about different components of your identity crossing over. Intersectionality is about layers of disadvantage. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about how Aboriginal women are intersectional, it's about different layers in which they are unequal to white women in society. It's a very different thing to the way that a lot of white feminism presents it, if that's okay too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because I think that, I can't remember what it was now. I think the pay gap between non-Aboriginal women and First Nations women is something like 17% or nearly 20% or something like that. Like, it's like the divide is huge, but we get left behind.
Yeah, and it's actually compounded. It's not like you just add the two different disadvantages in some mathematical formula. It actually, intensifies at those intersections, and we can't reliably measure the exact level of, disadvantage, but we know that it's extreme.
But the first time that I sort of remember hearing about this issue and registering it as a white woman was long before I met my husband, and I heard Noreen Young, who's a expert in diverse workplaces, especially pertaining to Aboriginal women and Aboriginal employees. And at the time, there was a big debate over whether we should bring in like affirmative action for board seats, in companies, and I just remember her sitting on this panel and saying, fuck your affirmative action. I want my kids not to die, and this is like, like the Aboriginal. I know, it pissed me off too, didn't it? It's really bad. And so, long before I was a parent to Aboriginal children, I was like, oh, hang on. Like, they've got much bigger fish to fry than whether board seats are 50-50, right? And this all feeds into the different, varying experiences of parenthood.
And as you said, like, it's no accident that you learned that at the foot of an Aboriginal woman who was able to speak
Just
from
got to listen.
her perspective. And yeah, I want to just ask you all finally to share, so that we end on a slightly more positive, hopeful note, to share an experience that you had when you were either in the decision-making process, or you still are in the decision-making process, or also as a reminder that for some people who've already had children, the decision-making process goes on about how many more times that you will go through it or can actually have any more kids. So can you tell us about a time where you felt really supported in your decision, that you maybe expressed your choice or your decision to someone? Jana, I was thinking before about how you said that that your mum was able to just assume that you were going to have kids, and I kind of made me imagine in a sliding doors way, like, what would have happened if you had said, I don't want to, and we all are going to be navigating our families, our communities, our partners, our relationships with, yeses and nos. And I think we've probably all been in moments where we just hope that somebody says the right thing. And so I thought if you could share a time where somebody said the right thing to you about either having more kids or whether you would have kids at all.
You're looking at me
I'm
again.
I'm looking at everyone.
Okay, I'll start. I don't know. I think that a friend of mine actually, when I was pregnant and I was terrified with my first living child, she said to me, just get ready because you're going to laugh. You're going to laugh harder than you've ever laughed in your entire life. And I needed someone to say something positive, because everyone says to you, welcome to never sleeping again. You'll never get your figure back. There were all these negativities, and that was the first time that anyone ever said, this is going to be awesome. You're going to have a really good time too. And there were tough times. Don't get me wrong. It was no picnic, as any parenting journey. No parenting journey is all picnic. But my God, we laugh. I mean, there are nights when we get into bed together when you're having the end of the day processing chat, and all we do is spin one-liners about the stupid things they've said that are just hilarious, and funny ways that they mispronounce things, and it's just really funny. And I wrote a column about it for the ABC. No one warned me how much my kids would make me laugh. And every new mum that I know, I send them this column and I go, get ready to laugh. Or new parent, I should say, not new mum. And someone the other day said to me, I share that with every new parent that I know. And it made me really happy, because I think, yes, it's hard, and yes, we have to be realistic, but it can also be the best thing you ever do. So,
yeah, that's really validating. Yeah.
I guess maybe I should give an example of something that's supported my ambivalence. But I think that something that's been really nice over the past year, through the interviews, but also just through speaking to people that have read the book or thinking about some of the same issues, is that all of the things that make you hopeful or anxious, whether it's, thinking about the ways you were parented, or climate change and anxiety around that, or, people who spoke to me about mothering millennial men and trying to be in a relationship with someone who you don't want to have a kid because you're already a mum, or whatever the anxieties that go into deciding whether or not to have a kid, is that none of them are really resolved if you do have a kid or you don't have a kid. Mm-hmm. And that was a really big thing I learned, which was just that, I have friends with kids who are like, yep, I'm still freaking out about the climate crisis. Yep, I'm still freaking out about these things, and or I still am hopeful about these things. And that was really useful in a way, because it's about learning to live with, not knowing.
Ambiguity.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about you?
So much, yes.
So much. I don't actually remember kind of one piece of positive advice, other than I feel like, and I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but I feel like my entire growing up, kind of in lots of ways, prepared me to be confident about becoming a parent. So it's never actually something that I was terrified about, because I'm the oldest of like whatever 30 grandkids or something like that. So I was always confident in the taking care of kids, all right? Like I know how to change a shitty mum and all that kind of stuff. And so I felt like that was always just, I don't know, like the reinforcement that you've got this, you're going to be good at this, it's completely fine, is a part of how I grew up. And also I think the other experience, like my experience growing up in family violence, and I remember being embarrassed lots of times as a kid for, you know, not having things that the other kids did, and like including like, you know, the kids, the neighbours getting lots of Christmas presents, all that kind of stuff, and saying, I really want that doll. My mum saying, you don't need that because we've got love. Which is just really sweet, right? Like that you could have all these things, but actually what's really important is the relationships you have with each other. And I think that's something for me that is just one of the foundational things. And also just doing what works for you. Yep. That's the other thing I learned about being embarrassed all those times as a kid, is just do whatever you want. Like, no one knows your life. Do what works for you, because everybody's making it up as they go.
And don't apologise for your kid either. Like, walk into the Senate with your kid and be proud that you're a working parent, because that's our reality. And I was so proud that you did that, because it was like, that's the reality that we live. Like, you know, get over it, Neil Mitchell.
On that note,
Sorry.
I was just going to kind of pull together what all three of you really said, which is that, you know, whatever your decision is, there are going to be people, hopefully there are going to be lots of people in your life who love and value you and know that you're in charge of that decision, and they're going to give you the support that you need. So I think that what I really hope that we can move towards as a society, and that everyone here, I'm sure, is already ahead of the curve on this, that the people in your life who decide that parenting is not for them can still be really warmly invited into your family spaces. And I would love to see more people start to think of children and children's rights as part of reproductive justice as everyone's responsibility, and a community that is truly invested in justice and is truly, you know, equal, would actually view children as everyone's. And so I hope that we can support the people who decide not to have children, and certainly better support the people who do decide to have children. And so, yeah, I hope that everyone...
And equally with my friends that choose not to have children, if you decide to go down that path, I can leave the kids at home and have cocktails with the best of them. So that's an option
Me
too.
too.
Yeah, we're in.
And I can't.
Get the sitter.
So that's another reminder.
I can give you. I'll give you our baby. I'll give you our babysitter's number, and we'll get you out.
Nan's for rent.
Yeah. Please join me in thanking the panellists: Senator Jana Stewart, Gina Rushton, Isabelle Oderberg. Thanks so much to you all for being an engaged and warm audience. Apologies for my nerves. I haven't done this for a long time because I had a baby. And I thought that I would have a baby and just, you know, carry him around and keep doing my work, and that's not what happened. Now he's 6 and I'm kind of just getting back into, I just wanted to be real for a second. And yeah, the labyrinthine childcare arrangements that have to happen in order for a single mum and sole carer to be at an event. I just wanted to say thanks for bearing with me when I could barely breathe before.
Karen, you've done an excellent job.
You've done a brilliant job. Absolutely brilliant.
Thank you. And I wanted to say to the organisers, thank you so much for fielding all the nervous phone calls this week and for ringing me as well. And that the next event is downstairs. It's Madison Griffith's Soapbox in the Moat, and that you can continue the conversation in the comments. You can book for the remaining events of the festival. And yeah, to the organisers, thank you. And to everyone here, you're doing a great job. So
thanks very
much.
Standing at the bench in the kitchen, waiting for permission, waiting to give myself permission to be free.